Hello, everybody. I'm Justin with Montana Farmers Union, the membership director. Our president, Walter Schweitzer, couldn't be here today due to a health-related issue. But I'd like to introduce Dr. Jane Mangold. She's going to be talking to us today about rangeland weeds, mostly focusing on Ventenata and houndstongue. You will be able to receive one credit for this webinar. So if you would just put your name and your applicator number into the chat box, type that in. Montana Farmers Union will take care of sending that into the state. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jane Mangold.
All right, thanks, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm gonna share my video or my screen here, and hopefully everything will work. Pull up my presentation. All right, are you seeing the full slide for the presentation and not the speaker view?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, good deal. And I'm just move that window over there so it's not taking up space in the slide. So again, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I am gonna just, when Walter talked to me about presenting on rangeland weeds, that was a pretty big pretty big topic. So he asked me, well, what are some, kind of up-to-date, newer things that you could talk about? And two things that popped into my mind were giving you some updates on Ventenata, whether you've heard about it or not. I'll include some recent research that we've been doing, and then an update on houndstongue, and more specifically, biological control. So that's what we're going to try to do today. I'll probably go through the information pretty fast. I'd like to leave time for lots of questions. So we're talking about rangeland weeds here, and here's just one picture of the type of system that I work in a lot, dominated by grasses, but there's also a lot of forbs out there as well. And these are the type of systems that I just love spending my time in the summer. And these rangeland systems, they are impacted by a lot of different noxious weeds. Two of them that we'll be focusing on today are Ventenata on the left and houndstongue on the right. Now, they're pretty different species. Ventenata is an annual grass. Houndstongue is a biennial to a perennial forb or broadleaf species. So pretty different species. They really don't have a lot in common with each other than, they're impacting these rangeland systems. They don't have much in common in terms of their growth patterns. However, they do have some things in common in terms of impacts. So Ventenata, some of the impacts that we're seeing associated with this species, reducing native plants and diversity. What we've seen so far is a reduction in forage for livestock and wildlife. I'll share some research with you about that particular topic. It's also believed that this species can increase soil erosion because it has a very shallow root system. Most of the roots are just in the top inch or so of the soil. And then we speculate that it's associated with a risk in wildfire. It's very similar to cheatgrass in terms of its growth form and what it does in rangeland systems. And we know that there's this positive association between cheatgrass and wildfire. So we're just kind of speculating that we could see similar dynamics with Ventenata. Some impacts of houndstongue, it also, displaces native species and reduces diversity overall. I think probably one of the biggest issues with houndstongue in terms of impacts is its toxicity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And those burrs that you find on houndstongue can get stuck in animal coats. And for example, with sheep, it can reduce the quality of the wool. So just a little bit about the impacts to hopefully get you engaged and help you think about, why these species are important. So again, we're going to cover Ventenata and houndstongue. With Ventenata, I'm going to briefly go over distribution, identification, some about its biology and ecology. I would like to share results from a study that we've done here at MSU looking at its impacts to forage. And then I'll share some results with you from a recent herbicide trial on Ventenata. And then we'll switch to houndstongue, a very brief overview, and then I will focus on the latest news in terms of biological control. So Ventenata is also called wiregrass. It's the light brown, yellowish grass that you see dominating this rangeland in the background of the slide. It was first documented in North America in the 1950s, and this is fairly recent for an invasion. If you think about spotted knapweed or leafy spurge, Canada thistle, you know, those species first showed up in North America in the 1800s, or even cheatgrass, you know, in the mid to late 1800s. So this is a fairly new invader to North America. It's been problematic in states to our west for a number of years, and then more recently, it's become a problem in Montana. It was first documented here in the 1990s, so again, very recent. And at that time, you would find it sporadically in disturbed areas like along roadsides. But it has been increasing rapidly. And I've just been kind of keeping track of the counties where Ventenata is being reported. And this is mostly just word of mouth. I'm not relying on any specific databases for this, but just in the conversations that I have with people as the extension invasive plant specialist. So here, there were about 9 counties in June of 2018 that knew they had Ventenata. About a year later, by late summer of 2019, you can see that the number of counties more than doubled. I think there's about 24 or 25 counties represented there. And interestingly enough, the places where Ventenata is showing up, it kind of follows the I-90 corridor in Montana. It was listed as a noxious weed last summer, and it is noxious in some other states as well. I do want to talk about identification, because if you're not familiar with Ventenata, it can, grass identification is difficult anyway. I have some slides to point out the key characteristics of Ventenata that you should look for, but there's also a couple videos on the Montana State University Extension YouTube page. One of them is about 5 or 6 minutes long, and it goes through cheatgrass, Japanese brome, Ventenata, and Medusa head. The other one is just about a minute long, and it focuses on identifying Ventenata early in the summer when it's a little bit more difficult to identify. So check those out. There's also an invasive grasses in Montana brochure that is available as well. So identification, we're going to start at the seedling stage and go all the way through a mature plant. The seedlings, grass seedling identification is pretty difficult anyway, so there's not a lot I can tell you other than the seedling leaves are very fine and they don't have hairs on them. And I say that in order to contrast it with cheatgrass, which has much broader leaves, and those leaves are hairy. Okay, and I kind of contrast it with cheatgrass because that's a species that most of us are familiar with. But very fine leaves, no hairs. Once the plant starts growing and getting some height on it out of that seedling stage, there's a couple things you can look for. One is these dark red or black nodes that are along the stem of the grass. And again, this grass is very fine. So, this picture is blown up quite a bit, but you're looking at pretty fine stems, and you'll want to look for those black nodes. And then another thing you can look for is what's called a ligule. And if you pull the blade of the grass away from the stem of the grass, this little membranous appendage will pop up on Ventenata. It's called a ligule, and it's very long and noticeable. It kind of has a tattered end or a tattered tip. you'll want to look for that as well. Once the plant starts to mature, you'll notice that it has bent awns. So those are the little appendages that come off the seed that help the seed stick to things and get around. They're bent, very similar to a wild oat, although it's a smaller, less robust seed, but it has those same bent awns. And then another thing that I have noticed, although I don't think this would be an official key to identifying grasses, but one thing I've noticed on most of the Ventenata that I come across in the field, it has the undulating pedicels. So the little stems that the seeds are attached to the main stem, they kind of wave, they're kind of wavy and undulating. Now this picture on the right is, this is probably taken in mid to late June in a typical year. And the plant's still green. And you'll notice that there's some seeds starting to mature at the top of the plant. But in general, the flowers and the developing seeds are very close to the center of the plant. It's kind of closed. It hasn't opened up yet. And it's kind of hard to tell it's Ventenata until you start getting to this stage. Now, probably in a couple weeks after that picture is taken, Ventenata fully opens up. All right, so as those seeds mature, they dry out, the panicle becomes very open. And in fact, the little branches or the pedicels that hold the seeds come off that main stem almost at a 90-degree angle. So it ends up giving the plant a very open, airy, and wispy appearance across the landscape. This is a photo I took in western Montana, kind of north of, between Missoula and Polson, where there's some pretty severely infested rangeland, and Ventenata is all that kind of yellowish brown, almost like a haze that you see in the plant community. So once you get to a certain time of the summer, this is pretty easy to pick out. It's earlier in the season that it's harder to pick out Ventenata on the landscape. So that's a little bit about the identification. Check out those videos if you'd like to review some of these high points. So what we've learned about Ventenata is it tends to be associated with areas on the landscape that are a little wetter than places where you might find cheatgrass. And I like this picture because if you can see kind of curving around at the base of this slope, you can see this kind of curvilinear infestation of Ventenata. Hopefully you can make that out. And what we've seen over the years is Ventenata first shows up in these places where it might be a little wetter. In this case, it's because it's at, it's in a draw, the base of the hills, and then it'll start moving upward or upland from those wet areas. There's been some work, this work is mostly based out of a project that came out of Idaho and northeastern Oregon, where Ventenata has been a problem for longer. But this same paper by Jones et al. Also found that Ventenata was associated with soils that were low in phosphorus and potassium. Now we've done a similar study here in Montana where we visited 5 different sites across the state that have Ventenata, and we found that it was associated with potassium, not phosphorus, but potassium, and we found higher Ventenata in places that had low soil potassium. So Michelle Majeski is a grad student who just finished up her program in July. We're working on publishing that paper. She's done some other work on Ventenata too, which I won't have time to share with you today. But we are learning more and more about this species. As I said, it's such a new species that there's very little published about it, and we're trying to learn more every day. Ventenata is a winter annual. So it has the same life cycle as cheatgrass or winter wheat. We were just talking a little bit about the planting of winter wheat before the webinar kicked off. So the seeds you look at the top of this slide, the seeds that were produced this summer have fallen to the surface of the soil. This fall, they will emerge as seedlings. They'll overwinter that way, staying as seedlings. And then in about June or so, you'll start to see, you know, the florets, you'll start to see those develop. And then once those seeds mature, the plant itself dies, and the seeds have to go on to continue the life cycle because it's an annual. So we will return to this, this life history or the biology of Ventenata when we talk about the herbicide trial that I'll share the results with you today. But before we get to that, I just kind of want to revisit our outline, and what I'd like to focus on right now within the discussion about Ventenata is its impacts to forage. So when Ventenata first started showing up in Montana, you know, I was kind of scratching my head like, well, we got cheatgrass, and that's been increasing over the last 10 to 20 years, and we have Japanese brome, and you know, that's kind of always out there. And then we also have a small area in Montana that has Medusa head. So when Ventenata showed up, I was kind of like, I wonder if Ventenata is really worse than these other annual grasses. Do I just keep doing research on annual grasses in general, or should we look specifically at what might be unique about Ventenata compared to these other grasses? So we were specifically interested in looking at how it might impact forage mostly for livestock, but both the quantity of the forage that's produced and the quality of the forage. So we had 13 different sites across Montana. 5 of those, each site was infested by a single annual grass. Okay, sometimes these annual grasses all kind of grow together, but we were looking for sites where only one annual grass was the dominant grass. So we had 5 sites that were dominated by cheatgrass. Those are shown with the little blue balloons. We had 4 sites that were Japanese brome. Those are shown in the green balloons. There were 3 of them over here near Miles City, and 1 in the breaks. And we had 3 Ventenata sites. They're not showing, they didn't show up very well, but let's see, oh, sorry, they're the pink ones. So we had 1 near Bozeman, and then 1 south of Missoula, 1 north of Missoula, and then we had our Medusa head site. So we went out to these sites and we collected information on the quantity of an annual grass relative to the quantity of perennial grasses, assuming that perennial grasses are usually what our cattle and some of our wildlife are eating. And this is what we found. We found that cheatgrass and Ventenata were associated with a decrease in perennial grass cover. So there's a panel here for each of our annual grasses, cheatgrass on the left, Ventenata on the right, and each one of those black dots is a data point. So that was someplace out there where we threw down frames and we collected information on the abundance of grasses and the annual grass. And you can see that with the cheatgrass panel and the Ventenata panel, there's this negative relationship. And what we found is that for every 1% increase in cheatgrass, there was about 0.4% decrease in perennial grass. So a mildly negative relationship. When we looked at Ventenata, that relationship became steeper. You can see that the slope of that line is steeper. And we found that for every 1% increase in Ventenata cover, there was about 0.5% decrease in perennial grasses. We also wanted to look at forage quality. So we collected the grasses out in the field, and then we brought them back here to campus and ran an forage quality test. So we have our 4 annual grasses shown in the first 4 lines of this table. And then we compared those to blue bunch wheatgrass and western wheatgrass, which are two native grasses that are considered good forage for livestock. And the crude protein is listed there for each of these species. And statistically, they were all similar to each other, ranging anywhere from 10% crude protein up to about 16% for blue bunch. And that's considered like good to excellent quality forage for crude protein. So, you know, good protein. What was probably the most alarming part about looking at these different grasses is the silica content. So silica is an element in forage that makes the forage difficult to chew, and it makes it kind of sharp and decreases the palatability. And in most cases, we're looking at, you know, 3 to 4% silica content, but with Ventenata, we're up to almost 9% silica. And anecdotally, people have said that animals just avoid grazing Ventenata when it's out in the field. And we suspect that it's due to this high silica content. So is Ventenata worse? Well, the results from our study suggest that cheatgrass and Ventenata are both decreasing forage quantity. There's minimal differences in the forage quality in terms of crude protein or fiber, but the high silica content in Ventenata is concerning. So it looks like Ventenata could have more impacts to our rangeland systems in terms of impacts to forage quantity and quality, because it's decreasing the quantity and it's decreasing the quality because of the silica. Okay, so that's a little bit specifics on that impact study that we did. I do want to return a little bit to the biology of Ventenata. It does rely on its seeds to be present from year to year because it is an annual. And most seeds germinate in the first year. So the seeds that were produced this past summer, most of them are germinating and emerging this fall. There are, you know, there is a small percentage of the seeds that hang on and maybe germinate the second year or the third year. But the research so far has shown that the seeds of Ventenata do not live more than 4 years. And this is good, okay? This is kind of like the Achilles heel of these annual grasses. If we can prevent the seed production for a number of, you know, a few years and wear down or deplete the seed bank, then that will benefit us greatly in terms of trying to control these species. So one of the things that we've been looking at is, you know, how can you use herbicides to do this? Unfortunately, at present time, we don't have a lot of tools in our toolbox for managing Ventenata other than herbicides. But the good news is there is a newer herbicide that is showing really good control of Ventenata and providing multiple years of control. So here's a list of herbicides right now that are labeled for range and pasture use. And they have Ventenata on the label, or they're commonly used for controlling annual grasses like cheatgrass or Japanese brome or Medusa head in range and pasture. So there's a variety of options here. The one herbicide that I do want to talk more about is indaziflam. It's marketed now as Rejuvra. It was formerly called Esplanade, and I'll explain that a little bit more in the next slide. And the application timing is late summer, early fall, but the important thing is to get it on the infested area before the seeds start to germinate. So a little bit more about indaziflam. It's pre-emergent and it is non-selective. So it doesn't care which seeds of which species or which types of plant encounter it in the soil. And what it does is it inhibits cell wall synthesis, particularly in the roots of an emerging seed, okay? So when a little seed is in the soil and it first it first sticks out, it sticks out that first little root that it's going to develop. When that root comes in contact with indaziflam in the top inch or so of the soil, it kills the seed. And again, it doesn't care if that's a seed of Ventenata, a seed of blue bunch wheatgrass, a seed of arrowleaf balsam root, okay? It's known to have limited impact to perennial, already established vegetation. And that's because these perennials aren't growing from their seeds every year, right? They're coming back from that root source. So what we've seen so far is, for the most part, is limited impact to perennials. It received its range and pasture and CRP label just this past summer. I mentioned that it was formerly called Esplanade, so you might hear it referred to as Esplanade, but it is now called Rejuvra. And the recommended application rate is 5 ounces per acre. It's a fairly pricey herbicide. It costs about $8 per ounce, so you're looking at about a $40 per acre cost of applying this. However, the research so far has shown that it will provide 3 to 4 years of control of annual grasses, including Ventenata. So you need to be thinking about that when you decide whether or not to make that kind of investment. So I'd like to share results with you from a herbicide trial that we've been following for 4 years now, where we applied indaziflam plus some other herbicides to Ventenata, and this is just north of Bozeman on the west side of the Bridger Mountains. So we had 10 different treatments. We included some of these commonly used herbicides for annual grasses like indaziflam, imazapic, rimsulfuron, or propoxycarbazone, or glyphosate. We had each of those applied by themselves, and then we had indaziflam plus these other herbicides. Now, the idea behind that is indaziflam is you have to get it on pre-emergent in order to control that year's Ventenata. If you miss that opportunity, you might tank mix it with some of these other post-emergent herbicides. So that's kind of the rationale behind why you might include indaziflam plus one of these other 4 herbicides. We sprayed these plots in November of 2016. The Ventenata had emerged. It was about 3 leaves in size. And then we followed these plots for the last 4 summers, so 2017, 18, 19, and 20. So I'm going to show you the data from those 3 years, 2017 through 2019. And I'll warn you that you're going to see a lot of colors in the next slide. But don't get freaked out. We'll walk through this slide together, and hopefully it will make sense. So here's the data from year 1, and we're looking at Ventenata control. So what percent of Ventenata was controlled? So the bigger the bar, the better the herbicide worked. Now the 4 bars over here to the left side of the collection are the herbicides just applied by themselves. So when we applied indaziflam, the first year after applying it, we got about 70% control. We got the highest control when we used just rimsulfuron by itself, followed by, and imazapic gave us about 60% control. So these 4 bars over here on the right that show higher control are when indaziflam was combined with one of the other herbicides. Okay, so it looked good the first year. I do want to point out that glyphosate, glyphosate this first year, that's where this blank is in the collection of bars. Glyphosate didn't provide any control of Ventenata. And this, we've seen this in Montana. In other states, they have seen some control from glyphosate for a single year, but we didn't see that in our plots. So this is year 1. Going out to the second year, you'll see that indaziflam is now providing nearly 100% control of Ventenata. The control from these other herbicides, which don't have the soil residual time, is declining. And then indaziflam combined with anything else is giving us nearly 100% control 2 years after spraying. Here's a picture of one of the plots. This was this 2018, 2 years after spraying. This is actually a control. This is Ventenata growing in here, that kind of lightish brown yellow color. Here's one of the plots that was indaziflam plus propoxycarbazone. I put some lines there so you could make out the plot a little better, and you can see the Ventenatas, you know, out around it, but not inside that plot. And you can see the bare ground, the open space where the Ventenata was growing previously. So year 3, indaziflam by itself or indaziflam combined with the other herbicides is still giving like 90 to 100% control. The control from the other herbicides that aren't residual has dropped to 0. So 3 years of control. I will say that we sampled these plots again in 2020, and I don't have the data worked up yet, but we didn't find any Ventenata in our plots where indaziflam had been applied. So we feel pretty comfortable at this point in time saying that we get 3 to 4 years of control of Ventenata with a single application of indaziflam. Now, I mentioned earlier that this product is not supposed to have any impact to perennial grasses. In Montana, and I will say that Montana has been unique in this so far. There's been trials put out all across the kind of the Intermountain Northwest, and they haven't seen the same thing, but we have seen some situations in Montana where there's been, looks like there's been some root stunting of some species of perennial grass. And Peter Rice at University of Montana has seen this and shared these photos with me. So, you know, we still are learning about this herbicide. There's a lot of studies still going on, but there's also been a lot of studies that have brought us to this point where the product is labeled. So the Rejuvra label does mention that they have a list of species that have demonstrated tolerance to Rejuvra. So there's some cool season grasses, there's some warm season grasses, and there's some forbs and shrubs. Now you'll see that the list isn't very long. There's a lot of species out there that we just don't know. They haven't been tested yet. So the label says if you're treating areas with desirable species not listed in the table, treat a small area first to confirm tolerance prior to large-scale use. So actually, I think in most places in Montana, we're in a pretty good position because we have small patches of Ventenata. It's not large landscapes covered with this species yet, for the most part. So, you know, I think we're in a good position to use this herbicide to control Ventenata. And what I'm really encouraged about based on the data that I just showed you is that we might get 4 years of control. If you remember back to the biology of this plant, we don't think the seeds live beyond 4 years. So we could see a drastic reduction in the presence of Ventenata by a single application, okay? But like I said, we're learning as we go, and you know, we still have a lot to learn about this species as well as how best to manage it. So I'm gonna stop sharing for the time being and just give you an opportunity. Let's see, I would like you all to enter in the chat box one diagnostic feature for identifying Ventenata. This is just kind of a check to see if you're still with us. So just type in the chat box one feature that you can look for on Ventenata to know that it's Ventenata and not some other grass. Bent on, all right. Good job, Charles. Rolled leaves with long ligule. All right, tattered at the end. Thanks, Jesse. This is how we make sure you get your credit. So if you need that credit, make sure you speak now. Dark nodes, yeah, 90 degrees as it matures. Fine seedling leaves, good. And they're hairless too. Remember, they don't really have hairs on them like our other annual grasses do. All right, well, you all were either listening very well or you just already knew all that information. But either way, that's great. I think you're in good shape to identify the species in the field. Okay, we're gonna go back to sharing. Are there any questions right now just on, actually I'm gonna stop share again so I can see the chat box. Any questions right now on Ventenata? I could cover a couple of them if you have questions, and then I do wanna quickly cover the houndstongue information. If you have a question, I think your option is to type it into the chat box. How many acres currently infested in Montana? You know, a couple years ago, we estimated it at about 55,000 acres, but that was really in my opinion, kind of a back of the envelope estimate. We don't have really good numbers, but it's enough, but not enough that we can't do something about it. Does it invade cropland? Not that we've seen so far. In Washington and Idaho, they've had some issues with it in like grass seed grown for, or grass fields grown for seed, but we're not really seeing it in other cropland. So on the seeds that don't germinate in year one, does the seed left in the seed bank lose viability? And if so, what rate per year? I don't know that for sure. It does lose viability over time, but you would have a small percentage. Let's just say, for example, 90 to 95% of the seed would germinate the first year. That 5% that hangs over to the second year, you'd have most of that 5% germinating again germinating the second year. So it's kind of this point of, it just diminishes over time. How does a person get a copy of your slide presentation? I sent a PDF version of the slides to Lindsay. So Lindsay, if there's a way that we can share those afterwards, I'm more than happy to share the presentation.
Yes, we can, because we're recording this webinar, and we'll also put it with the webinar on our website once this is over.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, let's move on to houndstongue. We can come back to questions when we have time at the end. Let's move on to houndstongue. I want to give just a brief overview and then give you the highlights of the latest on the biological control. And hopefully you're seeing my slides again.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, good deal. So houndstongue, it's mostly a biennial. It was first, it's been around for a long time, we're just shy of about 400,000 acres in Montana. That's what we've estimated in the last about 3 or 4 years ago. I think probably most of you are pretty familiar with it. It does like disturbed areas. It likes to grow in the understory, which makes it a challenge to manage because you can't always use herbicides if it's growing in the understory. And probably one of the biggest concerns about houndstongue is it's toxic to horses and cattle. And the burrs can get in sheep coats as well. An overview of management. This is personally one of my favorite plants to hand pull or dig, because it has this big taproot that it's so like pleasing and pleasant to pop this thing out of the ground early in the summer when the soil's still pretty moist. Herbicides, we have herbicides that work well on houndstongue. Anything that contains metsulfuron methyl or chlorsulfuron work well. The trick is just getting the timing right and being someplace where you can target the houndstongue without maybe getting it on some shrubs or trees that the houndstongue might be growing on. 2,4-D also works if you apply it to the rosettes. If you are using a herbicide, you want to make sure and use a non-ionic surfactant because it does have a lot of hairs. It's kind of a fuzzy little plant, so that surfactant will help those herbicides work better. Now there's been a lot of interest in biological control, and again, this is kind of what I want to bring you up to date on. There was a weevil, it's called Mogulones crucifer. It's a root weevil where the larvae eat the roots. This weevil was released in Canada in 1997, and it's proven fairly effective in Canada. Here's another picture of the plant. And I drew a little red cross, or a picture of the weevil. I drew a little red cross on the back of the weevil because that's where its name comes from, Mogulones crucifer, crucifer meaning like cross shaped. And it has this little white cross on its back. You can also see it up here in the photo. So if you're in a houndstongue patch and you find a little insect that you're wondering about, you want to look for this, the long nose and this white cross on its back. It's been effective in Canada, and this is some work that Rose de Klerk Float did in Canada shortly after, within a few years of the insect being released. So here we're looking at plant density on the top and percent plant cover of houndstongue on the bottom. At these particular sites where they were working, the weevil was released in 1999, and you can see the numbers there. And by 2001, they saw a pretty substantial decrease in the number of plants up in panel A and the cover of houndstongue at these sites. So it has proven very effective in Canada. It was not approved for release in the US because initially it was observed to feed on some non-target plants that are in the Boraginaceae family. And some of those non-target plants are, they're rare species. And since the time it was released in Canada, it's been against the law to move it into the US, but it does appear to be moving on its own. And this, I've been visiting with Melissa Maggio, who is the biological control coordinator for the state, as well as Jeff Littlefield, who's a professor here at MSU that works on noxious weed biological control. And the counties shown here in that purple pink color, those are counties where Melissa and Jeff have seen Mogulones. And you know, they've seen it in varying numbers with varying impacts to the houndstongue in the area. So it is moving around. It's making its way from, you know, up here probably in northwestern Montana, where it first started showing up, you know, down south and a little bit east. And just here's a few pictures that Melissa shared with me. Here's the root of a houndstongue plant where you can see how damaged the root system is with, I think that's actually an egg in there. What the insect does is it oviposits or lays its eggs in the stem of houndstongue. That's what these little dots are, where the weevil has laid an egg in there, and then those eggs hatch and the larvae eat on the roots. Here's a picture of a top of a plant with a little weevil, one of the little weevils on one of the leaves. And the adults also feed on the foliage, but the real impact comes from the feeding on the roots. So the plants, you know, they get stunted, they don't compete very well, and they eventually die. Here's a picture of the weevil down in some plant litter. Again, you'll notice that white cross on the weevil's back. So I just wanted to share some observations from the Western U.S. Again, these are some observations that Melissa has shared with me, both from her own observations in the field, but also visiting from land managers. In some of these areas where houndstongue used to be, it's hard to find, particularly in the northwestern part of the state. Some of the managers on the Flathead and Kootenai National Forests have said that houndstongue is not, they're not seeing it as the problem that it used to be. It's just kind of declining. And in northeastern Washington, again, in places where houndstongue historically been more common, they're finding just a few plants, and those are usually in areas that are very heavily grazed and plants are stunted with damage indicative of Mogulones crucifer. So it is moving around the state. It's having an impact on populations here. It is still not an approved biological control agent. So, you know, we should not be moving it on our own. It should only be moving on its own. The Montana Invasive Species Council had a science advisory panel about 1.5 years ago. And the goal of this panel was to talk about the feasibility of gaining approval to actively release Mogulones crucifer in the U.S. Another goal of the panel was to identify ecological criteria used to determine the safety of releasing it. We have learned more about this species over the years in terms of how it feeds on non-target individuals. And some of the outcomes from that advisory panel, it was a 2-day meeting where there were scientists and regulatory people present. One of the outcomes was to develop protocols for monitoring Mogulones crucifer and non-targets. There's some other outcomes that were there. One of the outcomes that we are currently working on is kind of the first one, to develop protocols for monitoring for the insect and its potential impact on non-target species. So we started a study this summer. This is Melissa Maggio, Charlene Singh, who's with the Forest Service, and myself. This is funded by some Forest Service dollars. We found 8 sites in 2020. We're looking to add 2 sites in 2021. And what we're going to these sites where we have houndstongue, we have other native borages, and the weevils. And we're looking at how the plant, you know, we're looking at the dynamics of the plant community as well as the dynamics of the weevil community to try to understand the impact of the weevil on both houndstongue and non-target borages. Here's a picture of puccoon, or Western stone seed, which is a native borage. So here's these red dots indicate where we have our 8 study sites right now. We're hoping to add one in Powell County next year, and another site depending on you know, where we can find our 3 things all growing together. And then Melissa plans to also have work with people in Idaho and Washington to do similar monitoring at additional sites in those states. So I would say stay tuned. The weevil is out there. We're collecting information to look at its impacts, and I just hopefully I'll have some results to maybe share with you down the road. Here's a picture of houndstongue growing in the forefront with one of our native borages in the background. So with that, hopefully we still have a few 10 minutes or so for questions. There's my contact information. I'm happy to visit with anybody about these 2 weeds or any other, you know, rangeland weeds that you'd like to visit about. I will stop sharing my, okay, I'm not sharing anymore, so we should be good. And yeah, I'll just see if it looks like we have some more questions. How houndstongue is starting to show up in the lower Yellowstone River Valley, like Prairie County, etc. Okay, thanks, Tommy. Yeah, I've given some presentations and worked with some of the folks up in northeastern Montana, like Daniels County. I'm spacing right now. Plentywood. I'm spacing the name of the county. I'm sorry. Let's see. Let me look at the map. Sheridan County, you know, Richland County. It has been increasing in the northeastern part of the state, which I guess would include Prairie County as well. Sheridan, yep. Yeah, so it'll probably be a while before the houndstongue weevil gets there. So probably if you wanna keep it from spreading, I'd do some hand pulling or some spot spraying. Other questions or comments about houndstongue or anything back to Ventenata? Any indication that we're closer to crucifer being approved in the US? Well, one of the outcomes of that science advisory panel was to talk about the type of data that might be required by APHIS and US Fish and Wildlife Service to repetition with the intent to repetition. And some of this work that some of the data and the work that we're doing right now, Melissa Maggio, we're hopeful that some of that information could be used as additional data to support the repetitioning. But my sense is that's still a couple years away. Mark Schwartzlander from University of Idaho did petition a different Mogulones weevil, I think just this past year, and it's actually a flower feeder. It's Mogulones boraginus, I think. But that has been petitioned. It's under the review process right now. Oh, I know Jesse says Western North Dakota is seeing an increase of houndstongue coming from Montana. I'm sure they're really thankful to Montana for that, right? you counties on the border, you do your job to keep it from spreading. Can you display your contact information again? You bet. Let me put that up. Whoops. Okay, hopefully. Oh, sorry. There's the other Mogulones weevil that has been petitioned. So we'll probably hear more about that in the year or two to come. Have you seen or heard of houndstongue becoming herbicide resistant from Charles? I have not. No, I haven't heard any cases of that. While people might be typing any other questions, I'd just ask you to put your name and applicator license in there again, since we're getting a little close to the end of our hour. And that will ensure that you have stayed tuned in during the entire hour and you'll get your applicator credit. So while we see if there's any other final questions, just take a second or 30 seconds to do that. Oh, Jesse says we're seeing houndstongue as an annual in Carter County. Are other places seeing this as well? Well, if anyone's on the webinar that wants to chime in on that, I have not seen that myself, but I have seen it behave as a perennial. I have found plants that you see the plant there this year as well as the last year's flowering stem. So some of the reading I was doing in preparation for this webinar said that I think it was something like about 45% of the plants that were followed in this study in Canada, in British Columbia, I think it was like 45% of those actually behaved as a perennial instead of a biennial. So, one thing about these invasive plants, these noxious weeds, they can, they have amazing abilities to kind of do what they need to do in order to reproduce. And, I could see some as an annual, if the conditions are right, maybe flowering and producing seed that first year. All right. Looks like there's a few questions there. Yeah, people asking about getting their applicator credits. We have both, Linda says, we have both annual flowering and perennial. Why they flower first year is interesting, but it is happening. Yeah, a lot of these, one of the things that makes some of these species so successful is they're really plastic. They can be really flexible and adaptive in their growth. which you know, allows them to be as competitive and invasive as they are. Well, I'd like to say thanks to Farmers Union and thanks to everybody that attended today for, you know, giving me this opportunity to talk about some of the things that I think are exciting about rangeland weeds. It's always fun to talk about, you know, the latest research and the latest information. So thanks for your attention and for giving me this opportunity and for working with MSU to hold these webinars.
Thanks, Jane. We definitely appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. And for those that typed in your name and applicator's number, Montana Farmers Union will get those and send that into the Department of Ag. So thank you for everybody that attended, and thank you, Jane.
You're welcome. Bye, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Thank you.